Thank you for listening to Footnotes, a Fellowship Mosaic podcast. This is a space for us to dig deeper into Scripture, what is happening in our community and culture, and continue the conversations we start on Saturday nights. We are excited to have you join us as we pursue truth, holiness, and redemption together.
Well, hey, y'all, and welcome to Footnotes. We are chatting today about the passing of Tim Keller. Today is May 24th, so he passed on the 19th, and we've just been reflecting as a team on the influence. A lot of us came through in our kind of formative high school and college years, and he was kind of the prominent shaping voice of this new resurgence in the leaning toward Reformationism way of thinking, and he just had a way of being both intellectual, but also I know the word that gets used for him a lot is winsome. That he was just ministering in a context where money is king and plurality is necessary, and he did a great job just loving people well into the kingdom, both cognitively but also relationally, and his church did a lot. And so I got Nick here. This is Noetzel, by the way. I got Nick and Collin here, and we just wanted to unpack a little bit of his influence in our own lives and in what we see at Fellowship. And so, Nick, you got kind of first thoughts out of the gate?
Yeah, I think it's really appropriate that we would do this because, you know, if the concept of this podcast is footnotes, things that follow up on the sermon, I've not done a study on this, but my suspicion is Tim Keller might be the most quoted person outside the Bible at Mosaic services. We quote him a lot. We've learned a lot from him. Yeah, I mean, when I just think about Dr. Keller and kind of some of the influences, I mean, I first encountered him in college. He had written a book called The Reason for God. And it's really him going through some of it. It's a basic apologetics book, but it read differently than any apologetics book I had ever read. And one of the big reasons was he wasn't just giving just awesome arguments to shut down unbelievers. Mm-hmm. He was really inviting a conversation with unbelievers that showed them respect. In 1 Peter 3, Peter says, "Be ready to give an answer to everyone who asks with gentleness and respect." And that's something that I think Keller brought and modeled for me so well as he was in Manhattan in a very not friendly city as far as American cities go to the faith. Very, very secular, very materialistic. And he brought gentleness and respect to the conversation and showed us how you can be incredibly loyal to biblical truth without being a jerk. And when I was in college, I remember I saw two paths, it seemed like. In so many of the churches I looked at, I saw churches that were very traditional in their theology and were ready to go to war with the culture. And that was very much their tone, was let's go to battle against the evil liberals. And that was kind of what I heard modeled. Sure. And then I saw churches that were saying, hey, let's love the culture. Let's love the people. Let's be inviting. And they were frequently compromising theology. Mm-hmm. Yep. And Keller seemed remarkably radical at the time for being incredibly traditional and orthodox in his theology without being some kind of culture warrior. And he just had this I want to love non-believers and I want to love them well. And that set a tone for me of how I wanted to do ministry and how I wanted to engage a non-believing world. So that was probably the first real encounter with Keller that was really impactful for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Nick and I were leading the student team together, and it was Antioch. It's a summer program where we do training, and we had this book called Counterfeit Gods. This guy named Tim Keller, and I'd maybe heard his name before or seen a video, but I was kind of at a season where it was like, I'm trying to figure out who I am as a pastor and not trying to take in a lot of other influences and find my own voice. And then I listened to Keller and I was like, all I want to do is just him. If I'm going to teach now, I just want to put a YouTube video of Keller saying what I was going to say. And so Counterfeit Gods became the first one that that was my introduction, and then continued from there. Nick just had a great way of even just modeling a lot of the things that Keller modeled, from how to not just stepping in and speaking truth, but doing it really lovingly and with doctrine and orthodoxy, but at the same time, kindness and Christ-likeness. And so Counterfeit Gods, he had a quote. There was one where he talked about that if you, on marriage, where our marriage and our relationships can become this idol for us. And he said that if you want to be a good groom, men, if you want to be a good groom to your wife, start by being a good bride to Christ. And then I was like, oh, that's so good. And that just sent me on a trajectory of reason for God and a lot of other and just seeking. And one thing that really formed me with Keller was he did these Veritas forums where they would bring in, it was like heavy, hard hitter, angry atheist to like more radical nationalistic Judaism to weird Zen Buddhism. And just, they would sit on a stage and just drill Keller with questions.
Yeah.
And it was like you were watching Jesus in conversations. Like he had that spirit of compassion, yet at the same time was just sharp and is like, wow. And COVID in particular, I think back to 2020 and the world's falling apart and are we shutting down? Are we not shutting down? All the conspiracy theories and you kind of watch this thing nationally, but as well as just within the church where it felt like there was this pulling apart. And I listened to one podcast he did with a guy named Carey Nieuwhof up in Canada. And it was the most unifying thing I think I heard in that season where he talked about how reaching the next generation, past generations, you could always start with a framework of understanding of there is a God, he is good, you are sinful. And that was how you presented the gospel to the kind of boomers in that generation. But this new generation, it's all about identity and who am I and how do I find myself and how do I express myself? And so how do you engage? And I'm listening to him say these things and I'm like, oh my gosh, I need this. Like, this isn't just for the lost Black Lives Matter movement on the street. Like, this is me. And he did one piece in that it shaped so much for me where he said, there's these 5 ethics within the Christian church and he put those forth. And it was, you look at the first century and he talked about the commitment to fidelity in marriage, one man, one woman, all nations, tribes, and tongues, multi-ethnic. And then he said 2 of those have become liberal in our culture and 2 of those have become conservative in our culture. And we as the church actually are called to hold them all. And it just was this like pressure valve was released for me. Yeah. And I was just grateful to have that voice.
I think one of the reasons, I could sit here and just list dozens of things that I've learned from Tim Keller. And I think one of the reasons he's had such an impact, I heard him say this a long time ago. It was a personal commitment he had, was that he wanted to resist the celebrity pastor culture. Mm-hmm. And I need to track down this actual quote, but what he said was he wanted to be faithful in ministry and in marriage for 25 years before he wrote a book. Mm-hmm. He just said, we don't need young guys writing books who haven't actually lived life faithfully for a little while. And so as a result, what you tend to find in Keller is that balance, because he waited until he had decades of ministry, making some dumb mistakes, getting it wrong, letting the pendulum swing to extremes, and kind of finding some wisdom. And I think our era where we treasure youth and trendiness and something that's going to blow up so much, we miss the value of wisdom. And I think when you look at what Keller did was he said for the first about 45 years of his life, he just focused on very faithful local ministry. He wanted to learn to be a good husband, a good dad, a good Jesus follower, and a good pastor. And then once he had a track record of faithfulness, then he was willing to say, okay, I'll share with the broader church. And I think that led to a stability, even in his preaching. The guy is the most kind of boring presenter ever. He's pretty monotone. He just gives his sermon pretty simply. And it's because it's all about the message with him. And on the one hand, like if you think about when we talk about Keller, we're not talking about his personality. We're not talking about how hilarious he is, how compelling he is, how visionary he is.
His fashion.
Yeah, we're talking about the content of what he taught us and the character of Christ that came through. And so that's really been encouraging to me, because I remember when I was in my early 20s, like one of the first questions I remember thinking when I got into ministry was, how do I get a podcast to blow up? And how do I get a lot of followers on social media so I can have an impact? And he modeled something different for me. And I think that's one of the reasons when I think back to who all the big name pastors were when I was in college, almost every single one of them is blown up, except for Keller. Blown up. I'm saying blown up in a negative way. Like things went badly for them, and we're not talking about them now. But I think Keller's faithfulness there really enabled him to have a witness and a ministry that will last and has impacted a lot of people. And I'm grateful. I know when I heard he died, it was interesting because I was sad for his family. There's this hope of the resurrection. And so in one way it was kind of information. And I didn't have an immediate too strong of an emotional connection. It was like, okay, he's 72, he died of cancer, he lived a good life. But the first place the grief hit me hard was I realized anytime there was a big cultural event, whether it was political or social, as people were all hitting social media with their opinions, I had a tendency to sit back and wait to hear what Keller would say. Because he had such a steady hand, and I realized whatever the next thing is, I'm not going to have Keller's voice. I'm not going to get to hear him speak into that. And I was really sad that I felt the loss of his wisdom, and so it also reminded me the same thing that I think I suspect if Tim Keller were to hear me say that, he would say, "You don't need Tim Keller's voice."
Yes.
You need the voice of Jesus. Because all Keller tried to do was just really look at the way of Jesus, look at how Jesus approached culture, how Jesus approached life and controversy and issues. And he really tried to reflect deeply on how does the gospel transform everything. And I mean, the branding for his ministry was gospel in life. And that's what he was really trying to do. For him in New York, the terminology of sin was not popular terminology, but the idea of idolatry worked. The idea that you're chasing after some god, be it money or success. And as Collin said, he said for the next for him in Manhattan, it was idolatry. He said for the next generation, it's probably going to be identity and identity questions. But that model, even though Tim has gone to be with the Lord, he taught me something about looking to Jesus and seeing the gospel reflected in everything. That I really hope that in many ways another generation of people, if we have some models of the celebrity pastor, or if we have the models of the quiet, humble, Jesus-centered pastor, I really hope a lot of us will follow in that humble, Jesus-centered pastor. In Philippians, when Paul is talking about how to walk with Jesus and how to model that, he points to a couple of examples, and he says, "Hey, you can look at Timothy and see how he's lived. He reflects well what I've done," and I just feel like Keller has been an example that I want to imitate. I want to imitate Tim Keller as he imitates Jesus, and he set that example for me.
And if you look across just the past year of news about evangelical leaders, and it's not great.
It's pretty painful.
It can be really discouraging, and to see just one that was like, faithful over influential. And he was faithful, loved his wife, loved his kids, and the bride of Christ. And I agree with Nick. It gives you that example to imitate of like, okay, I want to do that well. I want to follow Jesus and finish well. And, whether it was C.S. Lewis when he passed and the feels that were taking place and that community around him of like, that voice was so needed. And it really did. I mean, so influential for the church even after. Or I remember talking to one of our saints here at Mosaic about just Billy Graham days and what that was like and coming to Christ and being a part of those movements. And when he passed, it was this influential now almost of even beyond. And so I grieve death and loss of an incredible leader and man who I've learned a ton about Jesus from. And I get excited for how his voice will just continue to point, as Nick said so well, to Christ.
Yeah. Yeah, we as we come to the end of this time, the just the realization that death is not the way it's supposed to be. That I'm thinking about Ecclesiastes, and he set eternity in our hearts, and there's a longing or a recognition deep in the soul of man that when saints go home, though there's something to celebrate, and we're not grieving as hopeless ones, we're also deep in our guts. We know that it's not right, and so I'm even thinking about Keller in this space. I'm thinking about the saints at Mosaic that have gone home in the last 5-10 years, and have lived the same humble lives of influence. I learned of another one last week that I'd just missed the news on, and was just sad to hear that he had passed, and he had done decades of just loving his family and loving his church and loving his community really well. And so I feel like an old guy sometimes around youth ministry, but I'm also a young guy in the scope of years. And at this early end of life, I pray for that story for myself, that it would be a story of decades of faithfulness, and faithfulness at home, faithfulness to my community, faithfulness to my church and my kids. And I'm doing it all not for my glory, but I know that there will be potholes along the way, and I'm grateful that God's guarded and guided folks like Keller along the road, and continued in a path of grace for them. So pray that over you too, Mosaic, as you go about your day, that it would be the Lord with you, guiding you through, keeping you on that narrow road. We love you.